Good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce Jones. I'm the Vice President for Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this event, which we've titled Thinking the Unthinkable, War on the Korean Peninsula. Tensions between the United States and North Korea have been high and rising. From North Korea's testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles to its sixth and most powerful nuclear test, to the war of words between the two leaders, I think I'm not alone in worrying that the worst may come to pass in this decades-long conflict. Let's make no mistake, war on the Korean Peninsula, even without a nuclear exchange, would almost certainly result in an extraordinary number of casualties and throw the entire region into turmoil. The stakes could not be higher. In the past little while, things have taken a surprising turn. We saw first, of course, the move by the Kim regime to use the Olympics to thaw their relations with the South, or try to at least, in the first ever meeting between Kim Jong-un and the South Korean officials in Pyongyang. And then the unexpected move, or maybe expected, we'll find out, a move by Kim Jong-un to reach out and offer direct talks with President Trump, and the definitely surprising move of President Trump to agree. And just in case you thought this was the day where there would be a pause in dramatic developments, 5 minutes ago, the president fired Tillerson and put Pompeo in at state, or at least has nominated him for state, saying that it's in order to have the right team in place for the North Korea negotiations. There might be other reasons, but that's at least the official statement of intent. So there is a moment for diplomacy. I think we all hope and pray that that succeeds. I will tell you, I have spent my career studying diplomacy and war, and one of the realities is that ill-prepared diplomacy can fail dramatically, and ill-prepared talks have often been a precursor to dramatic escalations in conflict. So the fact of a moment for diplomacy is not cause to relax, it is cause for intense preparation and to worry about the potential aftermath. So to talk about all of this and much more, we have an extraordinary panel of expertise here today, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Young Pak here at Brookings to introduce the panel and the conference. Dr. Young Pak is a Brookings Senior Fellow and is the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies here, our foremost expert among several on the Korean Peninsula and one of the finest scholars employed here at Brookings. Has been, just yesterday was on Face the Nation talking about this issue, has been very prominent in the media on this, and has what I think is the best essay out there on the rationality of Kim Jong-un, which I would encourage you to read on our website. So with that, please join me in welcoming today's panel, and let me call Young to the stage.
I guess this is Clint Eastwood's chair for Obama.
Clint Eastwood's chair. Silly you. Silly. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce, for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased to have some of Washington's top Korea leads and my good friends and former colleagues in the U.S. government to have this important conversation about North Korea's strategic intentions. I know they're not strangers to you. So when I was formulating the conference, I thought, who could be the best people to talk about strategic intentions? And I didn't have to look too far to look around at my former colleagues and my friends on Mass Ave. Abe, to my left, is the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Prior to joining Wilson, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Sue is a senior fellow for Korea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to CSIS, she served as a senior analyst at the CIA, a deputy national intelligence officer on the National Intelligence Council, and the director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the National Security Council. Bruce, to my right, is a senior fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, he was CIA's deputy division chief for Korea and has served a total of 20 years at both the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So 75% of the panel has some CIA background, but Abe is not deterred from joining this group in any case. So thank you.
We'll be gentle.
So thanks to all of you for taking the time out this morning to join us. As Bruce mentioned, there have been several interesting developments. Over the past few months, North Korea has dominated the headlines. But with this conversation, I wanted to go beyond the presentation and the question and answer, the usual traditional format. And what I wanted to do was have this panel and have a discussion and have you join us in this discussion. And it'll be a conversation among the panelists, and we'll open it up for question and answers at the end. And one of the things I want to accomplish with this panel is to talk about what are the current developments on Korean Peninsula issues, but also to talk about and reassess what North Korea's strategic intentions are. Wanted to point out that there's some in the Trump administration and other experts who believe that North Korea has more offensive aspirations, that is to unify the Korean Peninsula by force. I think most people would say that North Korea's intentions so far are not to invade North Korea or invade South Korea in the near future, but for prestige, for coercive diplomacy, and for deterring the United States from attacking it. So we'll go through all those things, but first I wanted to open up the discussion or conversation about the two summits that are supposed to be happening in April and May. And what I think is striking, and please jump in to all of you, what I find striking is that what we have is a South Korean government readout of what Kim reportedly said. And then the Washington community and the Seoul community and the policymaking community has built this analytic infrastructure based on something that may or may not have happened. And North Korea has yet to either confirm or deny what they said, and that's probably to maintain their maximum flexibility on the issues and on their next steps. But I'd like to get the panelists' thoughts on what is driving Kim's outreach now, and what are South Korea's motivations for maybe polishing what Kim has probably said or might have said to present to the U.S. president. But the fact of the matter is President Trump has said yes to meeting with Kim, and I think it's in all of our interest to make sure that diplomacy does not fail. As Bruce mentioned, preparation is key. So I'll open it up to the panel for what you think is driving Kim's motivations. Abe, I know you wrote something about how we should support diplomacy, and
Sure.
wondering if you have any thoughts about what's driving Kim.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for putting this together. I think North Korea is being motivated by three factors, and of course, there's always a certain degree of speculation when it comes to trying to divine what may be motivating them. But I'll give you my best sense and throw it to the CIA to revise and extend.
To correct you.
as we used to. I think it's a mix of three things. First would be I think economic pressure has taken hold and is at least putting some degree of a squeeze on Kim Jong-un, limiting access to foreign capital, limiting their ability to fund some of their programs. Not to the point where I think they're really shaking in their boots, but I do think it's a motivator. Second, and I personal opinion would sort of make this the least influential, but I think it's certainly there, is concern about the potential for conflict. That all the talk coming out of Washington about various military options, bloody noses or beyond, I think at least has gotten noticed, although my sense is that the North Koreans didn't take all that too seriously. But third, and I think this is probably the biggest motivator, is that North Korea may not believe that they need to conduct these large-scale tests for a while. That over the past several years, they made significant progress in their missile programs, in their nuclear programs, a really unprecedented progress, made significant milestones. At the New Year's speech that Kim Jong-un made, he declared North Korea to be a nuclear power, said that they would shift to mass production. So their sense may be that their scientists and engineers don't need it to conduct these big-scale tests for a while, and that this may be an opportunity to open the door, to come to the table, see what happens. But I think the key here is that in all three of those motivations, there's no sense that I've had, that I've seen anything North Korea has said or done to even suggest that they're seriously considering or even opening the door to actual denuclearization. And to get to your last question about why South Korea may massage the message coming out, I don't know if they have or not. But I think it's clear that President Moon and his government want the Americans to come to the table to talk with the North Koreans. And if they can make that happen by presenting a welcoming and opening door for the Americans to go through, I think that it's something that they may do. But I have no information that they've actually changed the message. But I do think the key point that you pointed to is that we actually haven't heard from the North Koreans on this. For all that's come out of Seoul, all that's come out of Washington, North Korea has been radio silent, and I think that's a very important piece of it.
Let me tweak a little because I don't have something major to add. Just a little bit of tweaking. There's a slight difference. I broadly agree with everything that you've said. But I would just say first, when you're talking about sanctions, I would go a little bit further and say, I think sanctions are biting. I think they are hurting. It's as you talked about, the trade, the export is down, foreign currency reserve is down. So I think it's having a psychological toll on Kim Jong-un. On your second point about bloody nose, limited strike, that concern, I do think the North Koreans are spooked. They watch Washington, D.C. very closely, what's coming out of Washington very closely. Probably they're watching us. Hi. We had a foreign delegation that went to North Korea and came back and gave us a debrief. And according to them, the North Koreans were grilling him about, or these guys, about even Victor Cha not being nominated to be the ambassador to Korea. And they saw that as a sign that our policy is hardline. My point is they're watching very, very closely. And if we were kind of spooked about this talk of bloody nose and limited strike, trust me, I think North Koreans are pretty spooked too. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's sort of least important. I think it's still, it's a factor about that. And your third point was?
That they've made enough progress
Yes.
that they don't need to test for a while.
Oh yeah, so I think they need to buy time. I'm not sure if they do. I do agree that they don't need to test necessarily, but it doesn't mean just because there's a pause in testing, it doesn't mean they're not working on their program, right? So I think for whatever reason, they need to work on the program. So we don't know why they're pausing, but I would just say let's not confuse pausing with them stopping on their nuclear missile
So
program.
can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Is that sometimes it's not always about us.
Right.
And that there are, that there could be domestic drivers, right? So, A points to one thing, which might be that, okay, we'll focus on other things. But also, we have the 70th anniversary of the country's founding coming up this year, right? So what does it look like? What are the optics of Kim Jong-un going to Panmunjom, meeting with the South Korean president, moving closer toward unification goals, and having this picture, this first ever summit meeting, and it will boost Kim up. It will be a propaganda boon for him, and that would suggest to him that he's not just in charge of the nuclear weapons, but he's also in charge of unification.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back at Brookings, and I say back because my first job out of college was at Brookings. I was a research intern and then a research assistant for about a year and a half. So my little claim to fame is I think I'm probably the only person who's played softball for both Brookings and Heritage. Although admittedly now my throws from third base take a few more bounces to make it all the way to first. But Yeah, it really is an extraordinary situation we're in. I mean, it's sort of whiplashes because I've equated it to the game of watching a Korean Game of Thrones where, by late December, early January, you sort of, you're watching the script and it's the inescapable clash of armies. Everyone's preparing for this military clash, perhaps started by a U.S. preventive attack. Then all of a sudden, one season ends, the other season starts, and the writers have pulled a plot twist where now you don't see anything about military actions. It's the emissaries from the two kings talking to each other, the third king looking across the narrow sea, wondering what his ally king is up to. And now all of a sudden everyone's forgotten about military options, and we're all intrigued by the what's going on and the backstabbing and intrigue of the diplomacy. In the meantime, the army in the north is still preparing its fire and fury from above. And then with this sudden whiplash of diplomacy, we don't know if this is a diplomatic breakthrough or an invitation to the Red Wedding. So we'll see how it all plays out. But I think I agree with the others on the reasons for how we got here. I mean, we don't know, but I think it's a combination of many things. But in a way, every group of analysts can claim victory, and I told you so. So the hawks can say it's because of the threats of a bloody nose, a preventive attack, fire and fury. The doves can say, look, we just wanted to get to diplomacy all along. You finally have listened to us. We can finally get to where we want. The pythons, like myself, who advocate squeezing North Korea through targeted financial measures and pressure, in part to get them to the negotiating table in a meaningful way, can say, we finally had real pressure in the last 2 years, and that's had a big effect. And then China can also just sort of sit back and say, we were right. This is, we've been urging you two countries to get together. The whole problem is the U.S. and North Korea, that now that you're going to have a summit, as Beijing has always told us, this is the way to work it out. So everyone can claim to be right. And, on the hawk side, I think maybe the threats of military action perhaps had a bigger impact on the South Korean president than on the North Korean leader. I think part of the reasons that Moon Jae-in has been so energetic in his attempts at reconciliation between the Koreas is because of concern about a U.S. attack. I was in Seoul in January, had a presidential advisor reach out basically to say, I want to convey how extremely nervous we are. And so I think that may be driving South Korea. So as we move toward these summits, really, I just find it much more unpredictable than in the past, and that's on both the North Korean and the U.S. side, perhaps more so on the U.S. side.
When we talk about the InterKorean Summit, what do you think is going to happen? I suspect that they'll be talking about family reunions. The economic zone that President Moon has been talking about and trying to knit together the North and South, although I'm sure sanctions are going to throw a damper on these things. So what are some key things that we should be looking out for the InterKorean Summit? Any thoughts?
I'll jump in again. Well, I think sort of going to the U.S. side, I think a lot of us have commented that the U.S. side has a lot of critical vacancies in the roster, and then there seems to be kind of a thin bench on expertise. And this, in my view at least, sudden acceptance of an invitation is quite different from the past, where we might have looked for a bottom-up approach of working level officials meet, and if we have success, we move up and up the echelon until finally we decide to have a president. Moon Jae-in, who the U.S. was kind of being wary of look how eager he is, over-eager he is on a summit and an engagement. Well, when he was invited, he said, well, thanks very much, I'll take that under advisement. In the meantime, I'm going to send a delegation, and we're going to work some things out, like a common agenda before he agrees. And I remember back in 2000 when I attended White House meetings about Korea, Bill Clinton had been invited to North Korea, and he said, well, thanks very much. And some in the administration were saying the force of Bill's personality is so strong, if we just get him and Jong-il in the same room, we'll get everything we want, we'll eliminate 9 months of having to work it up through the echelons. But the majority view in the administration, which I thought was the proper one, was no, we don't deploy a president for a grip and grin meeting. We don't deploy a president to negotiate something. we deploy a president to sign an agreement where we know where every punctuation is on that piece of paper. So there were meetings going on in Kuala Lumpur talking about the potential parameters of a missile deal, and the U.S. officials have said, you've got to make us happy. And the North Korean officials were saying, if your president goes to Pyongyang, he will be happy. We say, that's not how it works. And so in my view, the administration chose not to send the president. So here we're doing really the total opposite. So I think on the South Korean summit, we're going to be looking for Seoul to be doing a lot of the legwork, in essence, for our summit. So if we have a thin bench in some cases, Seoul is going to be working on it. They go up first. We're going to look to what they agree to, maybe with some wariness. But I think they're going to be doing a lot of the prep work, sort of on our behalf.
Is it possible that South Korea would just talk about interKorean stuff and not about denuclearization and about the bigger issues and just leave that for the U.S.?
I think I'm leaning towards that because I think it's so hard for South Korea. I mean, what can they do? They're kind of they're constrained. They cannot really lift sanctions. They said they won't. The sanctions will continue. They're not going to open Kaesong Industrial Complex. They cannot. There's not a lot of give that South Koreans can give to North Korea. So instead of focusing on the big stuff, I think they will focus on the Kumgang family reunion. A lot of little things that they can achieve, and they leave the big stuff to Washington. But even the big stuff, my concern is, I don't know if we have figured out exactly what our deliverable is. Like, what are we going to achieve? And what do we want? I think our sort of what we expect and what North Koreans, I mean, we're just so at a different place. I think this is why it's really hard to figure this out, right? We don't, what is our goal? Do we even know exactly? It's before May, it's around the corner. Do we know what we want out of North Koreans in this meeting?
I think for the Trump-Kim summit, if it happens, it has to be all hands on deck. Bipartisan, all Korea experts, people who've negotiated with the North Koreans, for a crash course on how to negotiate with the Koreans. And there are plenty of people who have been in the same room with the North Koreans working on these issues. But I also think that there's nowhere to go but down if these two leaders clash. I can see two ways where there are a lot, risks and opportunities on both sides. One is if they really don't get along, and that their desire for quick results, their personalities, or that their personal ownership of the issue will quickly have them both dig in their heels, and there's an immediate confrontation. And then President Trump comes out and says, we tried diplomacy, they're not serious, this is never gonna work, and we're back to locked and loaded. On the other side is, what if they do get along? What if their personalities do meld, and they really reach a rapprochement, or they really have a chemistry between them? And Kim taps into the president's inclinations to be wary about alliances, about cost sharing, burden sharing, and North Korea says, we'll give up ICBMs.
Yeah.
And you can remove the troops or radically decrease the number of U.S. troops on the peninsula, and then we can have a sort of leader-to-leadership dialogue and just channel, and that leaves out South Korea. So I think the Moon administration right now has a greater tolerance for having direct U.S. North Korea ties or conversations in comparison to the previous administrations. But I think South Korea could easily be sidelined in that kind of scenario where North Korea or where Kim and Trump get along really well.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up because I 100% agree with what Jong just said. Those are my big two concerns. The first one, if it doesn't work, you've already used an engagement diplomacy card. So you say, okay, I've done that, it doesn't work, and now the risk for conflict has increased because there are a whole lot of different places to go from there. But the first, and the second point she brought out, North Koreans are going to say, we need regime security to give up nuclear weapons. And that's going to make sense, right? We need regime security, but what does that mean? That translates to U.S.-South Korea breakup of the alliance, and really when they talk about peace treaty, which they wanted for many, many decades, and they're going to bring that up, what does a peace treaty mean? Once you sign it, it sounds good in theory, but it means also putting out of U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. And then you can they can say, well, we'll will pledge to denuclearize, but of course, then there's a verification issue. So I'm concerned about sort of the extreme scenarios of both coming out of that. I guess the most optimistic scenario is that they just sort of agree in theory, principles of denuclearization, and we'll work together. And
Which
sort of,
is a big deal because
Yeah.
Kim Jong-un has never said
Right.
anything to the effect of denuclearizing anything. So far, he's only cemented North Korea's nuclear weapon status. It's in the Constitution. He has taken personal ownership of it, being photographed with every missile head and smoking cigarettes at every missile launch, right? So if the South Koreans were able to extract those statements from his cigarette-stained mouth, then great.
Yeah.
That's a big deal because that's a change. Because at least he is now paying lip service to denuclearization. But that said, it's still from his father's playbook of
right.
saying the
It's
right
a long way
things
to go from there,
and dragging us all into this long slog of negotiations.
So I think there's two things I wanted to mention. First on, we need to focus more as a policy community on the InterKorean Summit. I think the potential summit between Trump and Kim is obviously very important. It needs a lot of work, as you said, all hands on deck. But the summit between President Moon and Kim Jong-un, which is going to happen definitely, is also very consequential. And if North Korea continues to stay quiet between now and then, in terms of statements about what it's actually willing to talk about, what it's actually willing to do, then the summit may be an opportunity for Moon to extract some sort of statement like you suggested, to set the stage for a good summit between Trump and Kim. In that summit itself, I agree with Sue about concerns about two scenarios, right? That either it doesn't work and Trump throws up his hands and says, diplomacy is a failure, we have to go to phase 2, right? Or another option, as you suggested, being that they make a deal.
Yeah.
And either it's a great deal or it's a bad deal. But I think there's a third option. You suggested it here, and I tend to think this might be a way, an objective for us in the policy community to think about, which is really to flip the script. Bruce mentioned how we usually go through the echelons of 9 months of meetings and then have this thing. And Trump has really flipped that. We have the summit. Summits are incredibly complex things to plan, but they are very rarely, if ever, an actual place for actual negotiations to take place. There's a few examples here and there, but usually the summit is the time where the process comes to a conclusion and both sides agree to something that was already agreed to, right? So this may be an opportunity to flip the script where the two leaders come together, making some sort of principled agreement, potentially even just restating substantively what was agreed to in 2005, the six-party talks in 2005, and then directing their governments to begin a process to negotiate under those principles. And that may be a way to sort of deal with the short timeline that we have. And it's actually similar to how the Obama administration negotiated with Russia and Medvedev on nuclear issues, where the two leaders had a meeting. Then they sort of paused the summit. The two teams got together to work, and then they met again to review what the two teams had done. From a policy, for the policy community, that may be a way to move forward, where we talk about principles, we set vague but hopefully mutually compatible objectives between the leaders, in which the two sides then can have a bit of a mandate that they can negotiate from after the summit takes place.
I like your point about how we should pay attention to maybe using the InterKorean Summit could set the table for, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, that would involve a lot of discussions and coordinations and consultations with the South Korean government, as well as Japan, because right now, Tokyo kind of stands alone in terms of, they've been consistently on maximum pressure. Yeah. They're probably blindsided by the InterKorean Summit and the potential Kim-Trump Summit. So I think we need to have close coordination with the allies.
Yeah, I think right now the U.S. and South Korea are in a really good place alliance-wise. I mean, I had been concerned about what policies Moon Jae-in would pursue, but I think he's adopted a much more centrist policy than I had thought he might. And I think a lot of that was driven by North Korean actions. Just as I think Obama adopted a tougher North Korean policy than he had planned on because North Korea showed it would act as badly to him as Bush, I think the same was true as Moon. And I think the two allies are talking a lot. That said, there's still going to be a wariness. I think the U.S. is going to be wary about, all right, what's Moon going to do when he gets into that room? What's he going to promise? What's he going to come out and say he said, et cetera. I think he faces a lot more constraints than Kim Dae-jung or Roh Moo-hyun did because internationally you've got the required sanctions. Moon has admitted now that Kaesong would be a violation if he reopened it, et cetera, et cetera. And also domestically, there's a much stronger South Korean public support for the alliance than under Roh Moo-hyun's time, and there's much greater wariness of engaging with North Korea and much greater concern about North Korean actions. So, Moon is under a lot of constraints, but we're still going to be nervous about what he does. Now, looking the other way, I'm kind of imagining Moon Jae-in, now that we have this U.S. summit, he's sort of kicking back, popping a beer, saying, okay, we're not talking about preventive attack. I got Trump and Kim in the same room. Oh my God, I got Trump and Moon in the same room. Now he's opening the bottle of scotch, and he's just saying, because who knows what's going to happen. I think, as Abe pointed out, usually a summit is just to sign something or to agree to things that have already been worked out. Here we're doing it the opposite. A lot of people would say this is the way to do it. It's the experts as well as the previous administrations were all to blame for why we're here. Do the top-down approach, be unpredictable, all that. And Trump, I think, figures he'll go in like a CEO talking to a CEO saying, look, I got people, I got minions to work out the details. We'll work out a general agreement here, and then the people will write 57 paragraphs. So, but the concern I have is sort of with the thin bench on expertise is already we've seen officials saying things like, well, North Korea has agreed to abandon their weapons. Like, well, no, they haven't. Even in the South Korean version of what supposedly North Korea agreed to, they're not saying that, and there are a lot of really heavy strings attached. Also, we're seeing statements like, well, North Korea is saying things they've never said before. It's like, actually, they're saying the exact
Also,
same
they're
thing.
allowing us to have exercises.
Right. But they're saying exactly what they've been saying for at least the 24 years I've been doing it. So if people think that they're agreeing to things that we've already achieved, things that North Korea has never agreed to, if you don't know, well, look at this agreement, this agreement, this agreement, and if you don't know what hostile policy means, then you can agree to something not knowing it's as bad a deal as before.
So let me comment on that if I could. I think there's a difference between not having the expertise and not listening to the expertise, right?
Okay.
I'm both going on.
I'm concerned, and I was disappointed, very disappointed, that Victor was withdrawn as ambassador. Concerned about the minimal appointments that have come through on Asia policy across the government. My successor still hasn't been appointed, and my position wasn't even Senate confirmed. They haven't filled that position. But that doesn't mean that there's not expertise in the room. Our charge in Seoul is very experienced, very knowledgeable. We have a lot of people in the State Department, in the White House, in the Pentagon, who know Korea really well, who know all this history, have been working on it a long time, and they're extremely good at what they do. My concern is that, for whatever reason, that expertise is not translating into what is being said by top leadership. You quoted, I think it was Mike Pompeo that was saying those things over the weekend. That tells me that this huge base of knowledge within the government is not being used by the top leadership. And that is equally concerning, and if not more concerning. And I actually had the same points. I also noticed my favorite quote from the weekend from the administration, in addition to all the things that you mentioned, someone said that the summit may not happen, but if it falls through, it's certainly North Korea's fault, which is pretty great at setting expectations.
So I want to move on to some, so we wanted to talk about current developments.
Yeah.
because I'm sure you all had questions about that. But I also wanted to discuss with my colleagues here about North Korea's strategic intentions. So this is one episode, right? The InterKorean Summit, Kim's outreach, the Olympics, the possible Kim-Trump summit. These are all just episodes in a bigger story. And in the intelligence community, in the annual threat assessment, has long said, and I think all of us has worked on the ATA, has long said that North Korea's nuclear weapons are for prestige, deterrence, and for coercive diplomacy. I think in juxtaposition with that long-held IC assessment, which is probably going to change, I'm not sure, is the national security strategy document, which is supposed to be the grand strategy of the United States, that said that North Korea seeks nuclear weapons to kill millions of Americans. So those are completely different, or different. They're different on the different sides of the threat spectrum, and I think that reflects in part the variations in what North Korea is really going after. I'm sure when we're being interviewed and we're writing papers and all of these things, that what does North Korea really want? Is it survival, which is one side, right? And deterrence, deterring the U.S. from invading North Korea, or is it that they want to use their nuclear weapons to invade South Korea and unify by force? I don't know that there's a right answer or wrong answer with North Korea. It's we're putting forward our best analysis and our estimates, but I'd like to get your thoughts on where you are on that spectrum, if that's helpful.
So let me begin with that. I think it's a timeline or so. It's not like North Koreans. I think all of us are in agreement. Even the hawks should be in agreement that North Korea is looking to have this capability for regime preservation. I think there's no debate about that. Regime preservation, survival is defensive thing, is the utmost priority, right? North Koreans themselves have said all the time, they bring up the case of Iraq, they bring up the case of Libya, what happened to Gaddafi. He's dead. We don't want to be dead. This makes sense, right? This is the ultimate deterrence against the United States. I think everybody agrees with that. The coercive diplomacy part, the offensive component, I think that makes sense. It's a long-held IC assessment. It's not something that's ridiculous. I think, why is it a ridiculous thing to assume that, or to say that North Koreans, if they can, beyond just survival, use this nuclear weapons capability to do something that serves their interests? Well, it's not unrealistic. And part of that, of trying to decouple, you hear oftentimes analysts talking about North Korea was to decouple U.S.-South Korea alliance. That is not a ridiculous statement. It makes sense from North Korean perspective. It's part of regime survival. If you could decouple the alliance, there's how many thousand, 27,500 American forces sitting in the South. Why would you want that if you're North Korea? So if you can decouple the alliance, kick the U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula, that also makes sense. The unification on its own terms, that's the most controversial part, because a lot of people who are pushing against that idea are saying, well, that's ridiculous. How can North Korea possibly unify? Well, the capability is different from goal or intent, right? So first of all, that's a separate question. It's controversial, but they also don't have evidence that North Korea gave up on this goal. It's just that the only thing they can cite is that it's not realistic. But I think it's something that I think you might have said in your piece, that it's something that you can still hold on to as a goal to see if that's possible long term, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, if there's a peace treaty, if the U.S. forces are off the Korean Peninsula, see if you can, but it's not something that's definite. It's not something that they're capable of doing, or it's something we can also even influence. I think
so one of the things that that keeps me up at night is, lots of things keep me up at night. My kids.
Sick children, yeah.
Sick children. Right. Lots of things. But one of the things that keeps me up at night is, am I wrong? Are we underestimating North Korea? Are we being overly optimistic if we say that this is just that nuclear weapons are just to broaden their way of poking and prodding and getting their way on certain things? Do they have this grand vision? I don't think they're there. I think it's this goal that they hold up. But I also believe in human agency, and that we and the government and our allies together can make sure that they don't get there, and that Kim doesn't have the confidence to think that, yes, I can fulfill the dream of my grandfather who tried to unify by force.
Right.
So I think there's some space in between those two. And I agree with everything that you both have said. Obviously, I think at least in the short term, the goal is deterrence, all the things that have been said before. But if you look over the long term, even if the ultimate goal is unification, there are implications for North Korea to having a credible nuclear deterrent. That I think it's very unlikely that once they decide they have a credible deterrent, whatever that may be, that they sit back and say, okay, we have these weapons, now let's open up and become a normal country. I actually think that there's a great deal of potential for nuclear coercion. In fact, history and political science literature suggests that nuclear powers often initially try to engage in nuclear coercion. And you can see that already. They've talked about that a bit. And when they talk about use of nuclear weapons, they've said very broad things, that we would not use nuclear weapons except for countries that violate the interests of North Korea, which can be huge, including international sanctions, which I actually think nuclear coercion is something that can be handled fairly directly. We've handled that before. The other piece, though, is I think it has significant implications for conventional deterrence. That if North Korea feels comfortable and confident under a nuclear umbrella, that they may feel emboldened to lash out at South Korea, at Japan, at the United States, below the nuclear level. We've seen them, they've done this without nuclear weapons, without an ICBM, I should say. In 2010 and 2015 on the DMZ, they've done it throughout their history of lashing out either conventionally or asymmetrically below the nuclear level. What political scientists call the stability-instability paradox. And I worry that if North Korea feels confident in its nuclear deterrent, they may say, in 2010, we attacked South Korea and they didn't attack us. If they were deterred then, they'll certainly be deterred now that we have a credible nuclear capability. And so if North Korea continues down this path, if they do become deterrent, I think there's a lot of room in between saying, okay, we have a deterrent and let's go unify the peninsula. There's a lot of trouble they can cause on the spectrum before that, and that's where I'm most concerned.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, I sort of see three lanes in the road. One is it's just for defense or deterrence, and that you can have it as both a benign, oh, poor little North Korea, they've only wanted these weapons, to defend themselves against the big bad U.S. Look at what we did to Iraq and Yugoslavia. I think that's overly benign interpretation. I think it's deterrence to prevent the U.S. from responding to something North Korea has done, particularly to our ally. Kind of the other end, and if you're on the more benign side, you're more likely to advocate freeze for freeze or sort of a concession for concession kind of thing. On the other end is they're coming south. They want to unify the peninsula under the red banner. And to me, the folks who are advocating that, it's sort of like if you're at CIA and you're walking through the Korea issue group and you're like, well, where's Bob? Oh, he's under his desk with the helmet on because he read North Korean propaganda about they're going to turn us into a sea of fire. And he's like, oh, that's right, it's his first week on the job. Okay, Bob, come on out. They say things like that. So, they do have a war plan. I mean, Kim Jong-un, when he came into power, said, I want a new war plan. I want to be able to occupy Seoul within 3 days and the peninsula within 7. That means they're going to go chemical and bio early and perhaps nuke. So they do have a plan. So it's not just the benign defense. But, and along with that is sort of, as Abe described, kind of the subset would be coercive diplomacy, tactical attacks, all that. I'd be in the middle where it's not just the benign defense. They do have a plan, but they're not coming south as long as they understand the correlation of forces today, as long as we have an alliance, we have U.S. forces there, and when they say remove your forces, we say no.
Right.
So, they do have the plan, so we have to be wary about that, and that's why we have Op Plan 5015 and Con Plan 5029 and the counter-provocation, contingency plans, et cetera. So we've got, we're planning for that. We have to be wary, but that's why we have alliances and they're vigilant. So, I think we have to kind of look at the middle of the road, is prepare for the contingencies, but you don't have to and the folks on that side are kind of advocating the preventive attack, and many of us have written about why that's a bad idea for many reasons. And Sumi and Jung and I had a trilateral op-ed, which was pretty fun, where we listed a number of reasons why we thought a preventive attack was not a good idea. We call it CIA-splaining, which, Abe, you see, that's a case where 3 people, CIA.
I appreciate that.
No, I think Bruce is absolutely right. The reason why we're getting a lot of pushback on the unification thing from some folks are people, because if we admit that somehow we are advocating kinetic action as a policy response. But that's not what we are saying. I think Bruce is absolutely right. You can still have that as a goal. That's why I said there's a difference between intent and capability. We don't have to allow that. We can say, no, we're not leaving. You're not going to decouple U.S.-South Korea alliance. It's stronger than ever. It will continue to be strong. And we push back on that. So just because you admit that there might be the long-term goal, it does not mean,
right.
We need to therefore do what? I mean, then, we still be calm and stick with our contain and deter and, defense and alliance coordination and all this.
Yeah, so, but consider this. So since Kim Jong-un came to power, he's done the Sony hack and various other, the U.S. attributes WannaCry and the Bangladesh bank heist to North Korea. He's used a nerve agent in an international airport to kill his half-brother. He is boosting conventional military training. He's diversified the locations and the types of missiles, ballistic missiles, and has developed the road mobile system. Why is he doing all of this then? If it's not on the side of getting ready for that war plan.
Yeah, I think you can attribute different things to different motivations. I think assassinating his brother is a lot more about his own personal power than getting ready for the plan. But I think it demonstrates who it is that we're dealing with and who the president is going in to negotiate with. It's still a regime that holds Americans hostage. It's a regime that the Trump administration identified as a sponsor of terror. This is a terrorist leader that he's going to be seeing, and it's a person who's ordered the deaths of several of his fellow countrymen that he saw as threats. So this is, as the president would say, it's a bad hombre that we're dealing with here. But just because he's a bad hombre doesn't mean that he's suicidal. Doesn't mean that he's irrational. Doesn't mean that he's going to sacrifice his life and the life and the existence of his country in some apocalyptic vision of what happens forward. I think deterrence has worked for decades. I think, and if the U.S. and our allies, we work together to make sure we maintain a good deterrent, make sure we stay ahead of the game there, I think deterrence should stay viable for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, all the reasons you point out as to why it's a real threat, why, I disagree with folks who say, oh, it's a paper tiger, there's no real threat there. It's still several years away before they can do anything, and they've been saying that for several years. With the missiles, as you point out, they're not only testing a lot, but they're launching from mobile launchers from many locations throughout the country, so that it's would be harder to target them either preemptively or retaliatory. So the fact that they're developing SLBMs, which would expose South Korea's flanks to nuclear missile attack, because right now none of the systems that South Korea have can defend against submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They have SM-2s, which are good for anti-ship missiles, but not anti-ballistic missiles. So a number of other things, solid fuel missiles that are quicker to launch. And if we're wondering what their intent is, it's a lot of the missiles being launched are development, so they're testing. A number of the missiles, though, are exercising the war plan, the ones that are already deployed. And so when they launch 4 Scud extended range towards Japan, and we might wonder, I wonder what they were planning on with that. the next day announced we were practicing nuclear airbursts over U.S. bases in Japan. And then when they launched, and it was a no-dong, and they next day say, yeah, we were practicing a nuclear airburst over the port of a neighboring country through which U.S. troops would be flowing. And then if we couldn't figure out who that might be, they had a map on Kim Jong-un's desk with the range ring which showed Busan port. So they do have the war plan, they are exercising it, but as Abe pointed out, that's why we have the deterrence and all that. So even as the threat, the nuclear and the missile threat gets worse, I still think the strategy is kind of a, it's not satisfying, but it's more like the Cold War response to the Soviet Union of its, deterrence and containment and pressure, et cetera. About 10 components that don't fit nicely onto a bumper sticker, but I think that's a better strategy than preventive attack, which is, in my view, starting a war to prevent a war.
Do you think it's possible that Kim doesn't have a strategy?
No, I think he has a strategy, more of a strategy than the United States, to be honest. I don't know if we have a strategy.
Low bar, thanks. Okay, so I think we can open it up for your questions, and I'll, for any of us on the panel or for the panel as a whole. There are people going around with microphones if you're interested in asking your question. Anyone? Up here, please. Will you please identify yourself?
Yeah, Mike
and then
Macetic,
make
PBS
sure your
Online
question is a
NewsHour.
question?
I'm mystified to some degree by where Japan is in the middle of this. Sometimes Abe seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be acting that there could be violence in Korea and somehow he wouldn't be affected, or that Japan wouldn't be affected. How do you recommend the United States deal with Japan as we go ahead in these next months?
Well, I just came from Japan. When I landed in Tokyo, this news broke, and we were supposed to talk about a whole host of issues with Japanese officials, but this story broke. So they are mystified, they're confused. They were the ones who are very in line with the U.S. in terms of maximum pressure policy, in terms of imposing sanctions. Even when bloody nose talk was, coming out, I think they were still supportive of this administration, most supportive actually, but they were completely caught off guard and surprised, like all of us. So I think it's very important to obviously stay closely aligned with Japan as we are with South Korea. I think Prime Minister Abe is going to come before this Trump-Kim Jong-un meeting to probably talk about Japanese position. Of course, they're also concerned about their own issues when it comes to North Korea, like abduction issue. They're already talking about how to include that in as one of the deliverables for President Trump that he could possibly get from the North Koreans.
So after the news broke, President Trump got on the phone with Xi Jinping, Abe.
Right.
But there was a subsequent tweet where it said, Abe is supportive or something to that effect.
Happy.
And then in that same tweet, it was about the trade deficit.
Right.
So that doesn't help for one of your staunchest allies in the region who has stood next to you on maximum pressure.
Right.
But that points to, I think, the tendencies to talk about the trade deficit, the burden sharing, and these types of things, or revisiting the alliance, even as we're trying to work on the North Korea problem. Abe, you have any thoughts?
I think Prime Minister Abe deserves a lot of credit for engaging with Trump both so soon after the election and really built a robust foundation for that relationship. Generally, my sense has been that they've been pleased with the muscular and confident approach that the United States has taken toward the North Korea issue, and at various times towards China. But at the same time, I think Japan has been a bit quietly nervous about the muscular and confident approach that the United States has taken when it came to North Korea and China. The decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from TPP was a major blow for Abe. One that he's attempted to recover from and try making the best of. But the idea that President Trump agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un without prior consultation with his ally in Japan really inflames fear that Japan has traditionally had when it came to North Korea, that they get cut out, that the United States would cut a deal with the North Koreans or with the Chinese for that matter, and not consult with the Japanese, not represent Japanese interests in that negotiation. And that the decision to meet with Kim Jong-un spoke directly to that fear. So I think it's good that Prime Minister Abe is going to be meeting with them. And I completely agree with Sue that the key is to remain lashed up with our allies, both before and after meetings, to make sure that we're all on the same page, shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, I think, as Abe was saying, is that in the presidential campaign here, Trump said a lot of things, sort of negative things about alliances and free-riding allies and trade imbalances and stuff. But I think Abe saw it as, look, I live in a bad neighborhood. I really need to lash up tightly with the U.S. And so he developed a very good relationship with Trump. I mean, the best, I think, particularly early on. And then he was the most supportive of the firm sanctions and resolute stance against North Korea. So now with this sudden decision, it's a little bit of a case of, it's like, yeah, we're shoulder to shoulder with our U.S. ally. Where'd he go? With this sudden shift, I think now Japan is nervous. I had a visit by a senior official from Japan and could detect this. You guys are still going to be tough, right, on sanctions and sort of, you're not going to just go into a room and make a big deal that doesn't take into account the security concerns of Japan and others. And I sort of think back on like the agreed framework time when the South Korean president at the time was complaining we were negotiating South Korea's security over their heads. And that even though U.S. officials would say, look, before and after every time we meet with North Koreans, we are briefing the South Koreans. And the South Koreans were still nervous. They felt we weren't telling them everything. So, and that was one of the reasons why we had the six-party talks, is everyone's in the room together. Well, now as South Korea is meeting separately, the U.S. is going to be meeting separately with the North Koreans, Japan may feel like they're the one out in the cold and wondering what both the U.S. and South Korea will be agreeing to, because certainly they would be affected by any kind of clash in Northeast Asia, as well as the security situation on the peninsula if we start making agreements or concessions or removing our forces. So I think they are concerned. And that just shows why we need even more coordination amongst our allies.
I mean, and just as a final point, I would hope to see more South Korea, Japan cooperation on these issues. Next question in the back in the green sweater, please.
Hi, Stephanie Cook, Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. Thanks so much. This is a great panel. Could you addressed somewhat the change at the State Department. How is Kim going to read the accession of Pompeo to head of State Department? And how do our allies read it? And what effect do you think it'll have on the summit meeting?
This is, I talked about episodes earlier. I think this is yet another episode of the Game of Thrones or whatever.
You don't even watch it.
Yeah, I don't even watch it. But
Well, that's
but
like
this
when
has been a year-long story line, though.
I don't think it's too. I don't think it's shocking. I mean, I think, on one hand, you can say, okay, it's not a good sign in terms of diplomacy, just because Pompeo seems a little bit more hard on North Korea, less than Tillerson. But this has been out there as news for truly about, I don't know, at least 6 months. I think everybody's been talking about it. So I don't think it comes as a major shock. So I'm not sure if it's going to have such a great impact.
But I think it does show, to a certain extent, that maximum pressure, the policy of maximum pressure and engagement, maximum pressure is strong, but the engagement part is not as strong, right? Because Jong-un retired last week. He was a special representative on North Korea policy, and now Tillerson is out.
So let me take a slightly different tack on it. I agree with what you said, but I have sort of a different reaction to that. And it's less about Tillerson and Pompeo as personalities, as their as individuals. In any negotiation, in negotiations I've been in, if you look at them historically, one of the key features that for any negotiator is that they have to be able to credibly represent their leadership. That they know that your counterpart knows that whatever deal you make, you know that your boss will back you up, right? And everybody has known, if you just have to watch CNN or read the newspaper, that Tillerson and the president had a lot of problems and did not see eye to eye on a whole host of issues. And so that, for better or worse, made Tillerson less of an ideal negotiating representative in these sorts of meetings, similar to other officials that have come and gone. If Pompeo can credibly say he represents the president, and if the president is able to convey that sort of representational status, then it may make Pompeo a more credible negotiator in that, potentially more than Tillerson was, just because of the differences that he had with the president. That's my optimistic
That's a great point.
interpretation.
Good point.
I'll be skeptical. Now, well, one thing is the problem with using analogies is if they haven't watched Game of Thrones.
I'm up to date.
Yeah, but I use Game of Thrones on a TV interview, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't watch the show." You're like, "Oh." And it's sort of like when I did BBC TV, and I used a baseball analogy to explain missile defense. And they're like, well, I'm sure that's quite correct, Mr. Klinger, but we play cricket here. Anyway, on preventive attack, I mean, the view is that, General McMaster is most in favor of it. Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis were against it, and Pompeo seems to be at least perceived as more in the McMaster camp. So if Tillerson is out and Pompeo is in, some would see that as, you have more advocates for a preventive attack if this diplomacy thing doesn't work. So.
Up here, please.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, the Reagan Foundation and Heritage. I'm going to try to say or to make sense out of my talk. So many things going on in my head. You guys touched it, but just to remember, North Korea is the one requested this meeting. So my question is, what do they want? Why do they want to meet? Well, Trump didn't request this for this meeting, so that's my natural question. What do they really want? They're using this as a stepping stone to ultimate goal. What is that ultimate goal? Things like that goes through my head. I think this decision for this meeting was made long before Olympics. They just used the Olympics to come up with something like this. Long before, meaning 80s, late 80s, Kim Jong-il met with Clinton, and they came up with a pretty good deal. They got what they wanted from America. So maybe that's what they have in the back of their mind. We better do something because they are feeling the sanctions, as you mentioned. I agree with that. So my question is, what do they really want? I mean, two things. Number one, they want the U.S. to withdraw from 38 DMZ, or what else? They want to hit Okinawa or Guam, whatever. So there's a lot of things going on in my head. But I do agree with you. It may end up with just, okay, we're going to make this deal by faith only, and then go from there. Maybe end up with that. I don't know. However that is, I think Trump is the only one who can deal with this because he's kind of unorthodox and outside the box type of mentality. And this is probably what they're going to take to get something done. Something. Not all, but something. This could be number one step. So,
Okay.
anyway.
Thank you for that.
Well, I think the reason for having extensive pre-summit meetings between U.S. and North Korean officials would be trying to figure out what it is North Korea wants, or at least an agreed upon agenda. You know, we have issues we want to talk about, and we want to find out what particular issues they want to bring up. I mean, I think they want to try to drive a wedge, reduce the forces, et cetera. But at least for the purposes of the summit, we want to have an agreed upon, you know, we want to talk about denuclearization. We want to, you know, I think if they want to talk about a peace treaty, we'd want to point out that we should have a conventional armed forces in Europe treaty type negotiations that precede that, where you're thinning out the conventional force threat to South Korea rather than just signing a document. You know, so, you know, I think obviously they're trying to reach their objectives, which are reduce U.S. influence, U.S. Defense of South Korea and the region. So we need to work against that, but it'll be, you know, denuclearization, whether we bring up human rights in an initial meeting or not. But I think, you know, we would want to focus on security issues. They may want normalization of relations, peace treaty, removal of the hostile policy, a long list of things. So, you know, that's why you want to have meetings ahead of time so your president isn't surprised by what they're trying to bring up.
So if I could add another piece, and we haven't talked about this aspect of it yet, in terms of what the North Koreans get out of a summit. The summit happening in itself is a major victory for North Korea. Sitting down next to the President of the United States as an equal, as a counterpart, conveys tremendous prestige and legitimacy to Kim Jong-un. That's why I want to sit next to Sue. It conveys a lot of prestige and legitimacy to me. And so one of the things that struck me by the statements over the weekend by, I think it was Pompeo again, who said that we've given up nothing to sit down. And my reaction was just sitting down with the North Koreans at the presidential level is a major concession. So I think even if the event happens, even if nothing comes out of it, North Korea has already gained a tremendous amount of political capital as a result of the summit even happening.
No, I agree. And just quickly on that, I think still this is why venue is important also. That's wherever they meet, it's true that North Koreans are going to spin this domestically to say it's our nuclear strength, it's our capability that brought, look, U.S. president to sit down with us. This is something that North Koreans thought for a long time, and it's actually, Bill Clinton did not meet with Kim Jong-il. Later, only as an ex-president, but there was no American president that ever met with a North Korean leader. But I do think, so in this sense, also venue is important. I do think that, I hope that the president does not go to North Korea to give that extra legitimacy that he can spend to his people. I think more neutral location would be better, like South Korea, DMZ, or even a neutral country, third country, like, I don't know, Switzerland, Sweden, Singapore.
One of the things that I've been worried about is in thinking about why they tested so often the past few months and why they were so bent on digging in their heels and exchanging in this rhetorical war with the president is I'm wondering if they're looking for a deal with the president in terms of that no one else matters in this environment but the leader, but the top leader. That's clear from the Kim Jong-un perspective, and the constant shuffling and the demoting and the promoting within the Trump administration. I think Kim can see that as that President Trump is the only one that matters on this North Korea decision making. And something that nags at me in the back of my mind is was he doing all of these things so that he can try to cement a deal with the president early in his administration that he can reinforce in the next 3 years, which would be moving toward eroding the alliance with South Korea. So that's so I think that's one thing that I'm looking at.
But what would that ultimate deal be? Would it be a peace treaty? Would it be like, hey, let's normalize relations, let's conclude a peace treaty, and then in return our
right? So I can see Kim Jong-un tapping into President Trump's alliance issues, suspicions about alliances, and tapping into that that vein that runs through this presidential administration, and say and be in these drawn out peace treaty negotiations, or drawn out, I'll sacrifice the ICBM, but I'll keep everything else, which still keeps Japan and South Korea in danger. And building suspicion in South Korea and Japan about U.S. commitment in the region.
No, this is why I said this is one of my big concerns. It truly is that he's going to try to make this deal, because President Trump came in, before he even came in, he talked about burden sharing, like, well, why, he even talked about, like, why do we even need the forces there? I mean, and he talked about it costs too much. And so, again, I think Kim Jong-un understands this, watches this very
He's
closely.
been suspicious for decades about alliances.
Yeah.
So this is not a new thing.
Yeah.
So, and it only takes a quick Google search to learn that. In the back over there, please.
I have a question on China's role in this crisis. And from the China side, as North Korea's nearest and most powerful neighbor, China has a vested interest in the country's stability. And it is obvious that Beijing's priority is quite different from Washington's priority. And has America worked out a strategy to persuade China that the status quo is not sustainable? And is that be necessary to bring China to the negotiating table if the China and United States has not reached a consensus?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think at this point North Koreans want China involved. I think it's part of the strategy. So first of all, I think North Korea-China relationship has deteriorated. There's no love lost there. They actually despise each other. I think Xi Jinping does not like Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un does not like Xi Jinping. It's clear they have never even met since he came into power. That relationship is evolving and changing. Although you're absolutely right, I don't think China's fundamental priority or its interest in the Korean Peninsula and still wanting stability, still wanting buffer, all of this has not absolutely changed yet. There's still, the relationship has evolved. For this particular summit, I don't think right now, I think China is concerned about being left out. I think with this almost everybody's concerned, even though it welcomes this engagement in broad terms. But I think it's part of North Koreans. I don't know if they want necessarily China involved in this. It's kind of, they want to create fissure between everybody.
Right. I completely agree. Kim Jong-un has no interest in being anybody's little brother.
Yeah.
Right? Kim Jong-un wants to engage with the United States and be recognized as a major player on his own. So the fact that if he does indeed meet with the president, I think that's another piece of that. He's not meeting with the Chinese first. From China's perspective, I think they, similar to, as Bruce described President Moon potentially, they got what they wanted. The Americans are talking to North Koreans, but now they find themselves on the outside. And so there's always been this dichotomy from the Chinese perspective of saying, on one hand, this is not our issue, this is an issue between the United States and North Korea, they need to solve it between themselves. But then they would say, but China needs to play, has an important role to play in this dynamic. And I think you're seeing that here, where they're pleased on one hand that the meeting has been agreed to, may actually happen, but at the same time they're concerned that potentially the most consequential security issue in the Asia-Pacific is being managed without them, which is a direct challenge to their ambitions to be the most dominant, most essential, most critical power in the Asia-Pacific. And so how they react is, I don't think they're going to insert themselves at this point, but I do think if things go badly, especially, they may try to play a larger role. And from an American perspective, it's been, I think, one of the key accomplishments of the Trump administration. They do deserve a lot of credit for getting the Chinese on board with pressure. And I think it's important for the Americans to be demonstrating that they're open to play China's game. China, you say that you want us to engage, we're going to engage, but that means that if it doesn't work, that we've shown that your strategy doesn't work and you need to be on board with us more. So a lot of it will depend on what happens if and when this summit actually occurs. But I suspect that afterwards, China may try to play a more essential role. On which direction, on which side, I think is still up to speculation.
So I think because Kim and Xi hate each other, I think the venue for a U.S.-North Korea summit will not be in China. I think it's more likely that if it happens, it's more likely to be Moscow or somewhere in Russia, maybe in the Far East somewhere. But that's
It's
we're
interesting.
speculating.
In Bremer just suggested that, and Zakaria, he's like, I bet Putin's going to say, let's do it in Russia.
And Russia has been always this wild card in this drama. And Kim has shown a preference for Putin over Xi, maybe because he doesn't want to be Xi's younger brother.
I was just saying, on China, I think right now at least, they're seeing it positively because now we're not talking about preventive strike. That's been put on the back burner for now. And they would also see it as, well, vindication of their strategy of you guys just have to be in the same room together and talking, that'll be, will work. They also would see it as, maybe we don't need to really enforce sanctions as much now because they've served their sole purpose, which is to get North Korea back to the table, and therefore why should we stop turning a blind eye to stuff happening on Chinese soil? I think they also see it as, well, it's now even less likely the U.S. is going to enforce secondary sanctions against Chinese violators of U.S. law. When Congress sent a list to the White House of 12 Chinese banks that they think there's evidence for committing money laundering in the U.S. financial system, and the White House still hasn't taken action against any of them, and there's a lot of unclassified work on all the Chinese entities that are facilitating North Korea's prohibited programs, and this administration has continued to pull U.S. punches on things like that. So I think China would see it as like, well, it's less likely they're going to go after our entities. We don't have to push the UN sanctions as much. So I think a number of things they would see it as positive. And then even if the meeting doesn't go well and we start talking about, beating the war drums, I think China would say, look, you went back to the talks. You just need to try again and again and again. So I think on a lot of ways, even though they're going to be wary about being out of the room, I think they would see a lot of this as positive, at least in the near term, unless things go bad.
Yeah. Yes, gentleman in the blue jacket over here.
My name is Derek Boyd. I'm interested whether the panel thinks that the North Koreans can get an enduring agreement with the United States, because the panel has mentioned that it's not clear what the United States actually is aiming for in these talks, and also raised the point that negotiators have to be credible, and it's not clear to me that anybody can establish that position with respect to this President of the United States. So can the North Koreans have a realistic expectation of reaching an enduring agreement with the United States?
I think you bring, this is an excellent point. I do think Kim Jong-un regime is very, very skeptical. Bruce and I actually, we had an opportunity to meet with North Koreans. Remember when they brought up this, listen, they always bring up, first of all, 1994 agreed framework, and then they say, hey, we get it, you have a democracy, you have different president that comes in, and they bring up when President George W. Bush came into the office, whole famous excess of evil speech, and then whole agreement, they think, fell apart. And then they talk about, because your system is democracy, we get it, we can really trust it. You can have a different administration that comes in and completely scrap the deal. And this is why I think the Iran deal is being looked at very closely. And if we have an Iran deal, but if that gets scrapped, what does that say about any deal that North Koreans make with us? So already they're very, very skeptical of us, and I do think they question that enduring, can they really have a deal that they can trust with the United States?
So I don't think they want an agreement at all.
This negotiation process.
I think it's the process and the optics that matter more than the actual agreement or whatever agreement comes out of it. For North Korea, there's a lot of talk about, the hostile U.S. policy. They don't feel secure. They want security guarantees. But the regime requires a hostile United States for legitimacy and for it to succeed and to keep going.
Yeah, and in that meeting when North Korea was saying basically, how can we do a deal? You change your policy every 4 or 8 years. I said, yeah, democracy is pretty messy. You ought to try it sometime. It didn't go over well.
Yes, please, up here. Please wait for the mic. Thanks.
Victory from Global Peace Foundation. And talk about the meeting place. Mongolia former president Alberdoge, he made offer for this meeting. They say that they made arranged meeting for North Korea and Japan before, and then he went to North Korea before, and Mongolia has good relations with all the six-party nations. How do you think about this offer?
I'm very skeptical about Kim Jong-un going too far. I don't think he'll go very far. I think even going down to the border area is a big deal. So I don't. Yes, but Mongolia is also. I've also heard Singapore being bandied about as a possible venue. But you know, I don't think Kim wants to. You know, Jonathan Pollock, my colleague from Brookings, he said that his missiles have traveled farther than himself. And I think that'll probably hold true for a while.
Still, I mean, it's closer than, let's say, Sweden
Yeah.
or other places that also been mentioned as a possibility. So.
I wonder if Trump's pushing for some Trump resort over.
Yes.
I
And then charge the North Koreans.
No, I don't mean to be.
That's definitely flipping things around because
We usually pay for North Korea.
But I do think Mr. Trump actually cares about, because he does come from the drama, like the entertainment aspect of because this is going to be one of the most watched spectacle. I mean, so I think it's up to him. I think he would think about what makes most sense also in terms of the dramatic value.
I mean, to me, I thought Panmunjom for the InterKorean Summit was brilliant.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Because I had argued that it shouldn't be in North Korea. You shouldn't have the third time the South Korean leader seemingly goes to the greater leader and pays homage by visiting him. I had figured the cow had left the barn, that it was a done deal, but I had argued that it should be in South Korea, if not Seoul, maybe Jeju-do, the island of peace. And you could control security and control demonstrators better. So I thought Panmunjom was a brilliant idea. But and it would make sense for the U.S.-North Korean summit, but I wonder if Trump wouldn't want to do it because it's been done. If perhaps a driving force for agreeing to this summit is it's a Nixon goes to China, it's a first ever by a U.S. president, so it's historic, it's sort of high visibility, and would he not want to go to Panmunjom because it's been done? He wants something either more high visibility or just more unique for the unique U.S.-North Korea visit. But on the venue, I don't know. I mean, I think we should focus more on the agenda than the venue, but the venue is important, but the agenda is more important.
We have time for one last question. In the middle, in the back.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jill Baggerman. I'm a graduate student and research fellow. And my question is about kind of switching gears a little bit. We've assumed that this talk between the president and leader is going to take place. What would be the consequences and concerns if it does not happen? And who would most benefit if this talk is spoiled?
North Koreans have not confirmed or denied, so they have nothing to lose. It was up to, the ball was in the U.S. court, right? Based on what the South Korean government had provided a readout of that meeting. So for the North Koreans, I don't think they have anything to lose. The optics would be, from the North Korea perspective, that the U.S. has declined diplomacy yet again, right? And we're the good guys.
Yeah, I think a lot of it would just depend on the specifics of how it goes down. I mentioned before an official has already said that it'll be North Korea's fault if it goes down.
Yeah, right.
But I think from an American perspective, there is some political capital to be gained to be shown to be open to negotiations and letting North Koreans be the bad guy, letting the focus of international ire and attention be on Pyongyang and their behavior. And so staying open to engagement, trying to make it work, letting the North Koreans be the bad guys, I think is probably the way to do it.
Yeah, I think it depends on the specifics. If North Korea never confirms they're having a meeting, then we're just waiting by the phone. But however it goes, if it looks like it's North Korea's fault, they're being unreasonable, then the U.S. can say, look, we tried,
Yeah.
as we have tried many times before. If you talk to U.S. diplomats, that they've reached out, even on an unconditional sort of working level, and they've been always rejected. If the U.S. looks like, look, we're the reasonable ones, we've tried, and therefore, if you have to go back to the tough policy, whether it's sanctions and or military threats, then you would think you'd get better buy-in from the international community because you did try. If it looks like, and then even domestically, politically, you could say, we were tough, we didn't give in, others wanted us to have a meeting, it would have had concessions, and we don't do concessions with North Korea. Then that would also be a positive. If it looks like the U.S. is the unreasonable one, then I think it has kind of an international backlash against the U.S. where you may get less buy-in for a follow-on tough policy if it looks like the U.S. was the unreasonable one.
So I wanted to thank our panelists and my friends and colleagues for joining me on this panel today. But we talked a lot about diplomacy and about the two summits that are potentially going to happen. But what if diplomacy fails and there is a military conflict in the Korean Peninsula? And so Ryan Haas, my colleague at Brookings, will be leading an excellent panelists who will be assessing the costs of a military conflict in the Korean Peninsula. So sit tight as we switch actors. Thank you.